Hi everyone, Omi from CoLab here, and welcome back to the third video in our series on the basics of HTML and CSS. So in this video, we will be discussing the basics of CSS, short for Cascading Style Sheets. We'll explain how they got to that name later, but CSS is basically how they make web pages look pretty. It deals with everything from like basic animations to just coloring, fonts, spacing, responsiveness, just making your page look good. Obviously, HTML got us some of that basic content out onto the actual page itself, but CSS is going to help us make that stuff look pretty. So let's actually just jump right into it. CSS, again, it's just a basic text file, just like with HTML, except with the .css file extension on it. So I've actually created a file here called styles2.css, and I'm going to be working and building off of the base code from our last video inside of the part 3 folder right here. So the syntax for CSS, it's actually pretty straightforward. Basically, CSS is just a bunch of key value attribute mappings to dictate certain rules onto your HTML code. So let's say that I want to apply a color to my text. That would mean that I am going to have to follow this syntax right here. So this looks a little bit weird, but basically what's going on here, ignore this dot right here for a second right now, for a moment. We just want to look at this my class thing right here. So essentially I've made an identifier to represent my CSS rules called my class. So now if I need to refer to this CSS rule right here, more on how this works in just a second, I refer to it with the word my class. And then now inside of these brackets are all of the rules that my class represents. So the first rule that it represents, again, a key value attribute mapping, color red. So I say that I want a rule to change color. Now this color is a specific keyword that I know about in CSS that changes text's color. So I'm saying that this color attribute, it should be red. So color has its own default attribute that we don't have to worry about. That's what makes this text black. It will normally default to being black, but now it should be red. So the color attribute should now be red wherever I say that an HTML element should use this my class identifier. Okay, so if I go back to my code, I can say that I want my h1 tag to be red now. So I can say class is equal to my class. Okay, I believe that's what I named it. Yes, and if I refresh this, it's not going to be red just yet, but this is the general connection. Okay, so it's not red yet, that's on purpose, but this class is equal to my class is essentially saying that, again, like as a sort of like parameter, it's like a function almost, like for this specific h1 block, the class applied to it, so the CSS class, more on what a class means in a second, that class should use the my class identifier, and I pass that in as a string just to say, hey, find the my class identifier. That's the set of CSS rules that should be applied to this h1 tag. And the only rule is that text or font color should be red. Now it knows what red means. It knows to get the actual like RGB value. Just for like this color tag, you could also do things like hex codes or RGB values if you know about those. But you can also just give like a basic color name and it will know how to process that just as well. Now again, this has not actually shown up yet, and that's because we need to link our CSS code. Our HTML file doesn't know what CSS file to go into and look at unless we tell it to, and we do that by using this link tag. Again, this happens within the head tag because this is metadata. Like I mentioned before, it's just data describing other data, like saying, hey, where should we go to find our CSS file whenever we are told to go and look for like a class name. And basically all that we do is say rel is equal to style sheet. That's saying that what this file is that's being linked is a CSS style sheet. Hence the style sheet part of the name cascading style sheet. It's just saying, hey, go and look for that CSS file. And in terms of like where we should actually go look, that source should be styles2.css. So it's going to look just like that for us. And then, my apologies, it's not styles, sorry, it's not source, it's actually href. Was thinking of some JavaScript stuff right there. So href is essentially the way that we link over to our styles file. So we say that our href is equal to the pathing to that file. So again, a Unix style mapping with like the dot slash, where you can go up using dot dot, you can go multiple folders down, the exact same way that we actually got our image to display inside of our source right here. And then now if we refresh, we need to be using styles2.css because that's the file that I just made, and now it should say I'm really big, okay, in red. So again, we say that we are importing a style sheet. We say the pathing that it's coming from using href, not that other thing that I mistakenly said. And then we are going to say the class name passed as an argument to this class variable. And then we just put the actual identifier my class. Now a quick little distinction on what a class is and why I decided to use the keyword class here in line 8 and why I used a dot here on line 1 of my CSS file is because I made a CSS class. And what that means, a class is essentially just a bundle of different attributes within CSS. Now, that's like the most standard way of doing things, but there's actually another concept called using IDs. So instead of using that dot, we can use a pound key and then say my ID. And we can actually do the exact same thing. I can say like color blue, and then I can attach that using an ID. So I can say my ID should be my ID, and then now my text will become blue. And the main difference here is that IDs are unique. You can only have an ID can only be applied to one element. So no other HTML element here can have this my ID. But this class called my class can be applied to as many different attributes as I want. So I can give it to my p tag. Multiple things have it, but only one thing can have my blue ID. So again, IDs are bundles of attribute mappings just like classes are in CSS. It's how we refer to a bunch of different CSS rules and apply them to specific things. But IDs are only meant to be applied to one HTML element, while classes can be applied to infinitely many. Another way to do our CSS is actually to do it inline inside of our HTML file. There are these things called style tags, and you can actually do it inside of the HTML element itself. So like I could say like style is equal to, and then say like color red with some specific syntax. But I'm actually not even going to show you guys how to do that because we highly discourage that. And it's just not a practice that's generally encouraged throughout industry anyways to begin with, because writing your CSS inline, like putting it inside of your HTML file, really clutters things up. It just kind of makes it hard to read. There's also some rules in which like how it compiles that are slightly different than when you use a CSS file like this, and it's just not really something that people encourage. If you're going to write CSS code, put it in its own separate file, make it an ID or a class, and just kind of do it that way. And again, in terms of differentiating, you should. So if you're writing CSS rules that you know will only apply to one HTML element, make it an ID, make it clear like, hey, this is not something that has multiple use cases. But if it does and you need it to be applied to multiple different HTML elements, make it a class so that you can get by and compile your code correctly. Otherwise, that is it for this video. Thank you so much everyone for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.